Yo, what's going on, everybody? So, it was about a week ago, and I was in Washington, D.C., and it was very cool checking out all the amazing buildings and the museums and other stuff that were there as well. However, out of all the things that I checked out, the thing that stuck out the most to me was the fact that so many of these buildings' architecture just look borderline similar to each other. And not in a bad way, though, in a very interesting way. When you look at them, you'll see pillars just all throughout the buildings. And it makes you wonder exactly why that is the case. And so I decided to look into it. And the rabbit hole that it took me down was way bigger than I could have imagined. And I'm very excited to share the reasons as to why many of these buildings have pillars all around them. So let's start talking about it, and I'm sure all of you will be shocked to hear the big reason as to why these buildings look the way they do. So it was the 1600s, and you had many European groups escaping to America in order to escape harassment and discrimination. Think, for example, the Puritans, who settled in Plymouth County in Massachusetts in the year 1620 in order to escape British religious intolerance, and the Quakers, who sought refuge in Pennsylvania, founded by Quaker William Penn. You see, many people around this time believed in the concept of manifest destiny, whether it was the wealthy or the less fortunate, and basically it was a belief that America was the land of endless opportunity, and that they can take advantage of the endless amount of resources that were available in the colonies during that time. The creation of wealth in the colonies was very prominent for numerous industries which were in high demand, which really attracted the upper class to move from Europe to America for the purpose of setting up business with resources such as tobacco, cotton, and fur. Now for the lower classes, their reason for moving was even more interesting, as of course in Europe, many wouldn't have the opportunity to move up from their current stations in life, as the governments in their countries was still based on a class system, with the monarchy as the head, and it was expected that you would remain in the same class your whole life for the most part. Of course, I'm sure some people did move up, but of course it was not too easy to do that. So, because of this, many lower class citizens of European countries would actually agree to work as indentured servants for a select number of years so that they could be granted a free passage to America, where they can also take advantage of the numerous opportunity that was presenting itself and to increase their positions in life at the colonies in America. Now, while America presented itself as a place where people can better their lives economically, that was not the only motivation. You see, around this time, Enlightenment values, which were very prominent across Europe, started to spring forth more and more. Now, the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that emphasized reason, individual rights, and government based on the people, with what is known as a social contract, where the relationship between the people and the state is based on mutual consent in order to ensure that government is distributed fairly and that the people have a right to participate in governance. Many individuals were intrigued by philosophers such as John Locke, who emphasized natural rights and the right to overthrow a government that does not protect them, which eventually led to the inspiration of the Declaration of Independence, which emphasizes our natural rights as an American citizen, away from British rule, and as a right to have freedom, equality, and the right to self-govern. During this time, in the 1700s, many started to rebel against King George III, who was the monarch of Great Britain during that time, and they started to rebel against his harsh policies, accusing him of tyranny, as he would tax the people in the colonies on imported goods from non-British territories without representation, as the American colonists had no elective representatives in the British Parliament, giving them no say in laws when it came to taxes imposed on them. The people were also mad that the British East India Company had a monopoly on tea sales, where they were able to bypass colonial merchants, leading to the dumping of numerous amounts of tea in 1773, where 342 chests of tea were dumped in the Boston Harbor. This all eventually led to the American Revolution, where the colonies were rebelling against British rule from 1775 to 1783, and the Declaration of Independence was written as a way to justify the revolution. This was written by Thomas Jefferson, the eventual third president of the United States, and eventually the US, of course, gained independence in 1783 after the war, and set up their government inspired by a couple more philosophers I'll now go over. So while John Locke played a big part as being the main engine who guided the ideals of America to spring forth and also gave ammunition to starting a revolution and eventually setting up their own country, there was also a French philosopher known as Baron de Montesquieu, I hope I said that name right, who held the belief that power should be divided among different branches of government in order to prevent one person or group becoming too powerful, which eventually led to the three branches of government we still even see today, known as the executive branch led by the president, the legislative branch led by Congress, and the judicial branch led by the courts, reducing the risk of tyranny. And lastly, there was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I hope I said that name correct as well, who emphasized that governments derive their legitimacy from the people, where they can form a social contract and where individuals would willingly give up some freedoms in exchange for protection and governance, which reflects the general will. This then led to the US Constitution, which embodies the social contract idea by establishing a government by the people, for the people. The Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, ensures individual freedoms, protecting citizens from the government infringing on their rights. These three philosophers represent the core tenets of what America was founded on, and still linger on to this day. Whether they are still as effective today is a whole different topic, which would be a whole video onto itself. So when I was making this video, I was always wondering exactly, how did this all come to be? And of course, how did so many people actually agree to wanting this to happen? Many individuals in America were frustrated with the way in which the monarchy was in Britain, and they were frustrated with King George III. However, that's the government that they've been used to for like thousands of years, pretty much. And they wouldn't just want to come up with a new government like that right out of the blue, you know what I mean? Like, you would have to have a lot of influence. And what I learned is that many of the prominent members in the US, such as military personnel, business leaders, and politicians, are actually what are known as Freemasons. And Freemasonry was already prominent in Europe before many even came to the US. And in these lodges, they preach very similar ideals to what were promoted in these books. And they actually got a lot of inspiration from these three philosophers. And I'll go into exactly what Freemasonry is and why that played the biggest part into how we now have the laws in America. And even in other countries too, as a lot of other countries later on also started developing similar governments as monarchies throughout the world, of course, started to dissipate. And of course, Freemasonry, you could say, is a big reason for that. So I'll be going into why that's the case, and then of course how that led to a lot of the neoclassical architecture we now see all throughout the US, especially in Washington, D.C. Now, Freemasonry is a fraternal society which teaches moral, philosophical, and spiritual principles through symbols, rituals, and allegories. And believe it or not, it actually traces its origin to the medieval stonemason guilds, which were individuals who built Europe's great cathedrals. However, its deeper traditions draw from ancient civilizations, mystery schools, and philosophical teachings. Now, these stonemason guilds were an association of builders who were associated with the Middle Ages, and they were, of course, responsible for building the cathedrals and castles, where they would use symbols, degrees, and secret signs in order to train apprentices and protect their trade, keeping it secret. As cathedral building declined, however, some lodges began accepting non-Masons, which are known as speculative Masons, which led to the birth of modern Freemasonry. And then, of course, later on you had the Enlightenment philosophy, which emphasized reason and liberty. John Locke and Montesquieu's teachings greatly influenced Masonic ideals of personal liberty, self-improvement, and moral virtue, which were big things taught in the 17th and 18th century when the Age of Enlightenment was going on. The Enlightenment period was also seen as a time to revive a lot of those classical ideas of reason, virtue, and democracy, which had once been explored by Greek philosophers, Roman statesmen, and Egyptian mystics, and also were prevalent in some of those societies as well, such as ancient Greece and Rome. Freemasonry, of course, emerging as a prominent social and intellectual force during the Enlightenment, helped bridge a lot of this ancient wisdom with modern philosophy, intertwining the spiritual and intellectual pursuits of the past with the rationalism and moral ideas of the Enlightenment period. And so that led to a lot of connections between the two, where Freemasonry gained a lot of inspiration from these previous civilizations. For example, the influence of ancient Egypt on Freemasonry is evident with its symbolic use of the Eye of Horus, which represents divine protection and spiritual enlightenment. The Eye of Horus, which is also depicted as the Eye of Providence, symbolizes an all-seeing force guiding Masons toward higher wisdom. Additionally, the Egyptians' mastery of sacred geometry greatly impacted Masonic teachings. The concept of sacred proportions is central in the design of Masonic temples and lodges, which align with the Egyptian focus on harmony and cosmic order. Freemasonry is also deeply connected to Greek philosophy, their mystery schools, and sacred geometry, as well as the fact that democratic ideals were also very prevalent there. From Pythagoras' teachings on numbers and sacred geometry to Plato's vision on the philosopher king, Freemasonry adopts and preserves much Greek wisdom as their path to enlightenment. The initiation process, their emphasis on morality, and usage of sacred symbols in Freemasonry reflect the Greek traditions of intellectual refinement, ethical development, and pursuit of divine truth. The Greek civilization helped shape Freemasonry's core values, ensuring that the ancient wisdom continues to guide modern seekers of knowledge. In Pythagorean teachings, for instance, Pythagoras and his followers saw numbers as sacred and believed that geometry reveals universal truths, which is a belief that is reflected in Masonic symbolism such as the square and compass. Their fascination with geometric proportions in architecture aligns with the Pythagorean idea that mathematical harmony governs the universe. Now, just like the Enlightenment, where the ideas of freedom, equality, and civic responsibility were brought back, they were also around during the time of the Athenians, as the Athenian democracy also emphasized those three virtues of freedom, equality, and civic responsibility, which were of course ideas that Freemasonry eventually incorporated through its commitment to universal brotherhood. Not just that, but Socrates' moral philosophy stressed the importance of self-inquiry and virtue, a key element in Masonic teachings that encourages members to perfect their character. And so basically, just like in the government that was eventually set up in America and also in other places throughout the world, they placed a big responsibility on the people and for the people to make sure that they were doing stuff that was considered to be ethically correct. Now, in ancient Rome, there was what was known as natural law. And basically what natural law is that it is the belief that some rights are universal and come from human nature. This is very similar to what we then saw in the Declaration of Independence, for instance, which asserts that all people have rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was, of course, also espoused by many prominent Enlightenment thinkers, which got their inspiration from societies such as ancient Rome, like John Locke and Rousseau, for instance. Now, in ancient Rome, there was also a rule of law. In Rome, there was a Roman Republic, which was governed by a Senate, had magistrates and elected officials as well, which operated under a system of checks and balances, similar to the US, where under the US Constitution, they established a government with separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Now, in both of these societies, the goal was to emphasize the rule of the law, where no one is above the law, where basically no one group within these governments can have too much power, whether it's the executive, the legislative, or the judicial branch in the US, or the Senate, the magistrates, and the elected officials in Rome, and basically that can prevent tyranny, as not one single entity would have a gigantic sway in all the decisions being made. There needs to be a consistent agreement amongst all the members in order to have the best decision. That was their mindset, and that was their belief of how their governments can be the best properly run. And it was also the same belief espoused by philosophers such as Montesquieu, who believed heavily in the separation of powers within governments in order to prevent tyranny from occurring. Now, in Freemasonry, they were also deeply influenced by Roman natural law, as in Freemasonry they believed in moral principles such as justice and the equality of all people under reason and virtue as well. So they took a lot of the ideas from the Enlightenment period, as well as the Stoic beliefs of Rome, and also the democratic beliefs of Greece, and they believed very heavily in them as well, similar to the Enlightenment thinkers too. So they also were very big on the promotion of the new American democratic system, which later sprouted up. Now, Roman architecture, which was heavily influenced by Greek principles of symmetry, proportion, and sacred geometry, played a significant role in shaping Masonic symbolism. You see, the uses of arches, columns, domes, and sacred proportions in Roman temples and buildings reflects the Masonic reverence for sacred geometry, which is the idea that numbers and proportions hold divine significance, which I talked about earlier with the significance of Pythagoras. For example, you have the pillars of Boaz and Jachin, which I'll be talking about more later when I'm going into the significance of Solomon's Temple in Freemasonry as well. Basically, they represent central symbols in Freemasonry, as they represent strength and wisdom, which are virtues that are fundamental in Roman philosophy. Now, going back to the two pillars I stated earlier, one being Boaz, which represents strength, by the way, symbolically, and Jachin symbolically represents establishment or stability. They are two key pillars in Solomon's Temple, which is a biblical temple of King Solomon, and it is also a key central place in Masonic ritual and symbolism, serving as a profound allegory for personal and spiritual development. Freemasonry draws extensively from this biblical narrative of King Solomon's Temple, where it would integrate its elements to convey moral and ethical teachings. When individuals pass through these pillars, it signifies the initiate's journey into deeper knowledge and understanding, which emphasizes the balance between strength and stability in one's moral and spiritual life. Now, a key figure in Masonic lore that they also go over is the master architect of Solomon's Temple, known as Hiram Abiff. Now, his story has many parallels to the ancient Egyptian myth of Osiris. So basically, Hiram Abiff, according to Masonic tradition, was the chief architect of the temple who was murdered by 3 ruffians seeking the secrets of a master mason. His death and subsequent raising symbolize themes of fidelity, death, and rebirth. Similarly, in Egyptian mythology, Osiris, who is a god of fertility and the afterlife, was murdered by his brother Set, dismembered, and later resurrected by his wife Isis. This myth represents the cycles of nature and the concept of life after death. These parallels between these narratives highlight universal themes of mortality, the quest for knowledge, and the hope for regeneration, all of which are integral to Masonic teachings. Another thing that's also prominent in Solomon's Temple that they go over and also correlates with what I went over earlier with ancient Rome and Greek societies is sacred geometry with the spiritual temple. The construction of Solomon's Temple is often associated with the use of sacred geometry, which would reflect the belief that the universe is structured according to a divine mathematical plan. Freemasons adopt this concept metaphorically. You have the operative Masons, who historically are skilled craftsmen who employ geometry in building structures, and you have the speculative Masons, who are modern Freemasons who use the tools and principles of geometry symbolically to build their own spiritual temples, that is, to develop their character and moral integrity. This allegorical approach encourages Masons to view their personal growth as the construction of a temple within themselves, striving for moral and spiritual perfection. Now, to conclude, what I got out of this is basically with the symbolism of Solomon's Temple, the pillars of Boaz and Jachin, and the legend of Hiram-Abiff, and the principles of sacred geometry, Freemasonry offers a huge amount of rich tapestry for many different allegories, which symbolize their death and rebirth process. Basically, they go into Freemasonry as one person, and then with the wealth of knowledge that they accrue, they believe that they are rebirthed as a more enlightened individual. And basically, these elements collectively guide members on a path of self-improvement, ethical living, and a deeper understanding of universal truths. Now, during this time, when the new laws in America were starting to be put into fruition, you had many prominent Masons who were involved in the process, one being General George Washington, who was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War, which was created to help coordinate military efforts of the colonies in the war against the British, who sought to maintain control over the American colonies. Washington, who also was the first president of the US after the war, led the Continental Army to victory over the British. Next, you had Benjamin Franklin, who was a key diplomat and inventor, and who helped secure French support during the Revolutionary War. He also contributed to the Constitutional Convention as well. John Hancock, who was president of the Continental Congress, and who symbolized American independence through his prominent first signature on the Declaration of Independence. And then lastly, you had Paul Revere, who was famous for his midnight ride warning on the British invasion during the Revolutionary War. Now, while Freemasonry was prominent, there were others who were pro-Enlightenment, but anti-Freemason. And this was because they supported the philosophical ideals of reason, liberty, and progress, but they rejected the secretive nature of Freemasonry. For example, the Enlightenment would emphasize open debate, reason, and democracy. Meanwhile, Freemasonry would operate in private lodges with secret rituals. Prominent people who did not support Freemasonry were one being John Quincy Adams, who was the 6th president of the United States, opposed Freemasonry because secret societies could undermine public trust in government. Not just that, but many also feared Freemasonry's universalist religious outlook. You see, in Freemasonry, they were very secretive, and they would take on doctrines from many different societies that many would consider to be pagan for the most part, whether it's ancient Greece, Rome, and also ancient Egypt. And many believe that that would conflict with the Christian doctrine that permeated primarily throughout the US. And when they thought of Enlightenment ideals, most people wouldn't think that it had anything to do with any of these previous civilizations, and the fact that it had Masonic influence, as of course, like I said, they were hidden and most people probably weren't even aware of their existence. So many people throughout the US, they agreed with the Enlightenment values. However, they wanted full transparency, and they wanted all these laws in the realm of Christianity and under God. As a matter of fact, in the early 1800s, there was actually huge opposition to Freemasonry, especially after what was known as the Morgan Affair in 1826, where basically a former Mason, known as William Morgan, mysteriously disappeared after threatening to reveal Masonic secrets. And as stated earlier, they agreed with the Masons in ideals like reason, morality, and self-improvement, but they wanted the Enlightenment values of their new society to be focused on having full transparency and having democratic governments rather than having influence from private fraternal orders. Alright, so in 1790, Washington, D.C. became the official capital of the United States. Now, during that time, Washington, D.C., however, was still being built up, so they had Philadelphia be the designated capital in the meantime, and there were many reasons as to why Washington, D.C. was named the new capital of the United States. For one, Washington, D.C. was a neutral, unaffiliated location, and that would allow no one state to gain too much power over the federal government, especially because a neutral location wouldn't make either the northern states or the southern states feel like one has too much power over the other. And that is a very valid explanation, actually, as at that time, and even throughout the 1800s, there were many disagreements among the two sides. However, the formation of the new capital also was part of a new plan with an intricate design. You see, in a place where leadership is present, they want the background of that location to represent their ideals of democracy and not have any remnants of English rule, which many of the capitals, including Philadelphia, had many buildings that were designed by the British before Washington, D.C. came about and made their buildings represent what they wanted it to represent. And the way that Washington, D.C. was represented is full of Masonic influence. You see, Masons believed that architecture could represent Enlightenment ideals and sacred geometry, which aligned with the vision of their new republic. And in order for this to be carried out, they hired a man who was very close with George Washington and who fought alongside George Washington from Paris, France, known as Pierre L'Enfant, who laid out an intricate plan and design in order to create Washington, D.C. in the image that the Masons would like. Pierre L'Enfant was born on August 2nd, 1754, where he grew up and became a trained architect and military engineer in France. It was during 1777 where he came to America and he fought in the Revolutionary War, serving under George Washington in the Continental Army. In 1791, that was when he was put in charge with designing Washington, D.C., and his initial plan involved wide boulevards, public squares, and grand government buildings inspired by Masonic symbolism. In 1792, L'Enfant clashed with some officials, such as Thomas Jefferson, over changes to the project due to the cost and time constraints, as he was really wanting to stick to his original plan, but it was way too expensive. Many of the ideas that he had, like he wanted to make canals and stuff in the capital, and Washington, D.C. was a marshy land, so they couldn't afford stuff like that. And L'Enfant just wasn't budging and he wasn't making any changes, so he was relieved of his duties. However, many of his plans still remained, but they were just modified by a new architect named Andrew Ellicott, and he just simplified a lot of L'Enfant's grand plan, where, for example, if you look at the Capitol building today, you would see that the Capitol building is still at the center, which is exactly how L'Enfant wanted it to be, as a way to reflect the importance of democracy and government in the new nation. Now, in Washington, D.C., there are three very important structures which are there. One is the White House, which features the executive branch, aka presidential power and leadership, the U.S. Capitol, which features the legislative branch, which symbolizes the law-making body of government and the voice of the people, and then you have the Washington Monument, which honors George Washington as it stands as a unifying symbol of national strength. However, with both the monument, the Capitol, and even the White House too, they all have specific Masonic resonances as well. The Washington Monument, for example, which is also known as an obelisk, has long been used as a Masonic symbol to represent eternity, strength, and the light of knowledge in Masonic tradition. The monument is connected with the values of the ancient Egyptian symbolism, which is often embraced by Masons for its connections to mysticism, wisdom, and enlightenment. The Capitol is often associated with divine wisdom, insight, and the watchful presence of higher powers. The dome at the Capitol mirrors this symbolism, with its use of light and space, which also would create a sense of enlightenment and higher purpose. Now, when you think about buildings such as the White House and the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol Building and the Jefferson Building and many other buildings where you see this theme of pillars either in the front of the building or all around the building, that type of building style is what is known as neoclassical architecture, and it is a revival of the classical architecture once used in ancient Rome and Greece. Neoclassical architecture, which returned back in the 18th century, has a design which features columns, symmetry, and domes as a way to convey power, stability, and enlightenment, which then became the dominant style for government buildings and many other buildings today. The building is a representation of democracy and enlightenment, which are both things that were also very common in ancient Greece and Rome, and is also very big amongst Freemasons as well, as they thought that a building style such as neoclassical would be perfect to convey their ideals. Now, just like how the pillars of Jachin and Boaz were physically placed in the front of Solomon's temple, where they would stand as guardians at the entrance, which basically symbolically would mark the transition from the outer world into the sacred place of divine wisdom. Now, with neoclassical architecture, you could say that the concept is very, very similar, as when you check out these buildings, you'll see pillars at the entrances as well, and that would also create an impression of wisdom, stability, and power, similarly to how Solomon's temple did. Lastly, neoclassical architecture represented a new type of building. Well, not necessarily new, as obviously these type of buildings were used in Greece and Rome. However, it represented a shift away from the type of buildings that you would see created by the British in different locations like Philadelphia, New York, and Virginia, for instance, and you would see a new building style that can reflect the ideals of enlightenment in the United States, and that was also another big reason why those type of buildings were built as well. Thank you everyone who has made it this far, and I was very happy to share some examples of why neoclassical architecture is everywhere throughout Washington, D.C. And of course, it's not just in Washington, D.C. There's neoclassical architecture throughout the world. You'll also see neoclassical architecture in Europe and throughout many states in the U.S. too, probably all states, especially when it comes to government buildings and so on, as of course, with this type of government that we have, it represents power, stability, and the ideals of Enlightenment thinking. So of course, you'll see those type of buildings in government-based buildings and so on. And, if I was wrong about some stuff, feel free to comment about that in the comment section, as well as some stuff that I may have missed. I'm always happy to hear about what I can improve on in the future, and also ways in which I can become more educated. So if anyone has some added information, please feel free to share. Also, please feel free to subscribe, as I am hoping to make more information in the future about many different architects, as well as interesting architecture concepts that I would love to talk about. Thank you everyone for watching the video, and I hope to make many more videos similar to this in the future.